It's week 51 of 2021. I'm Smita Nair. This is your weekly fix. We're nearly at the end of this year, a good time as any to take stock of the health of our democracy. And a wonderful new book by one of India's pioneering data journalists, Rukmini, paints a detailed, even surprising in some measure, picture of modern India and who we are as a people. In Whole Numbers and Half Truths, Rukmini marshals data from multiple sources to interrogate some widely held beliefs and narratives of what Indians think and believe. Now, the entire book, I'd say, is essential reading, but there is one chapter in particular that I want Rukmini to tell us more about. Rukmini, thank you for making the time for speaking to our listeners here at Scroll.
Thanks so much for having me, Smita.
I thought to make the most of your time, we'll focus primarily on the chapter What India Thinks, Feels, and Believes. Before we get to granular data, can you give us a broad picture? If data could define or describe contemporary Indians and contemporary Indian society, what would that description sound like?
So, I think the picture of India that data paints is one that's close to reality, but one that many of us miss within our bubbles. And a lot of us don't like to admit that we live within these bubbles. And I actually find national data very humbling to work with because it does sort of show you the sort of rarefied part of the country that you occupy. And I'd say that data would first of all paint a picture of a deeply unequal country, and unequal not in the sense of the top 10% versus the rest. It's really like the top 0.01% really versus the rest, and it's quite staggering how much of public mind space that 0.001% commands. So I'd say all of the economic data on consumption, on expenditure, on incomes, on jobs paints a picture, even on health, of a deeply unequal country.
Okay.
I'd say data also paints a picture of a country that is at odds with some widely held and sort of deeply loved narratives, whether it is about a great push towards urbanization and sort of a big force of migration that we often see, portrayed in either the media or even in popular entertainment, which really isn't the case. I mean, I was actually quite surprised to see how little permanent migration there actually is, and how how small a portion of the overall Indian landscape that occupies. And I think when it comes to things like thoughts and beliefs and voting, things that are private matters deeply held, data again paints a picture of a misunderstood nation. And part of this misunderstanding is again easy narratives of the sort like voters like development, voters don't care about caste, those sort of narratives that the media often peddles that aren't based in reality at all and are very reductive. And I think in terms of thoughts and beliefs, it does paint a picture of a pretty socially conservative slash authoritarian tendencies country, which is again something that I think maybe liberals choose not to see about the country. They like to talk about this as a fringe.
Okay, let's look at one of those widely held beliefs. You contend that data belies the widely held narrative that Indians are at their core liberal and secular in their values, and it is political parties who appeal to their base instincts and trap them into narrow identities. You go so far as to say India at its core is conservative, even fundamentalist. Indians, the data appears to suggest, have a predilection for authoritarianism. Could you take our listeners through some of the data you passed that tells us this?
Sure. I do want to start by saying that, the point about the belief that Indians are at their core liberal and that political parties appeal to their base instincts is a widely held narrative that I disagree with both parts of it, both the liberal core of Indians, as well as the fact that this is what political parties are the only ones sharpening these instincts, and otherwise they don't exist in society. I disagree with both on both counts, both through the data and through what I feel field reporting has shown us.
Okay.
And yes, I do think that the data shows that what we consider basic sort of respect for civil rights and freedom of expression, democratic institutions, a lot of it is not very deep rooted in society. In internationally comparable surveys, for example, Indian respondents have even lower regard than Pakistani respondents for civil rights, for example, if that's a comparison that we often like to make. So things like not being particularly averse to strong authoritarian leaders, not being particularly averse to civil rights being upended in for some broader purpose. All of these beliefs that Indians have demonstrated in surveys, and I'd say particularly about religious beliefs. It seems to me that there's this sort of comforting lie that we like to hold to ourselves, which is that sure, there's a fringe who's intolerant, on all sides, but at the core, most people really respect other religions, and I just don't see that in the data at all. There is systematic, consistent opposition to the very notion of intercaste and interreligious marriage, let alone one for your own children, for example. Systematic beliefs that others should not be allowed to eat beef, watch movies that hurt religious sentiments. All of those are, beliefs that sound extremely intolerant and authoritarian, and are widely held across caste and religious groups, across income groups, across education categories across the country. And these surveys pop up from time to time, but I don't think that we've really sat down with our feelings around this, which is we haven't sat down to say, yes, well, survey after survey is showing this, and this is what the majority of people on the whole feel, to put it crudely.
Okay. Rukmini, how does someone like you who reads and analyzes all kinds of data determine what is good, truly representative data? For example, I know the Pew Research Center and the World Values Survey, both of which have conducted these global surveys that compare, among other things, the commitment to democratic principles of various countries are credible agencies. But India is a geographically vast and truly diverse country on various axes. What quantitatively and qualitatively would make for a genuinely representative data set for a determination like the one made by these two surveys that we refer to?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I like to talk about specifics on this sort of stuff, because I think sometimes when we talk in really general terms about these things, there we sort of engender a blanket suspicion without specific cause. So I do like to and would want to call out poor surveys, particularly because they're bad and we should call them out, but also because that helps distinguish surveys that aren't necessarily, or have done their work right. So I'd say there's a few things that are important. I think sometimes people get very hung up on sample size because this is a big country, but sampling frame is what matters much more, which is that if your sample is as representative as it can get on various demographic indicators, then you don't necessarily need to have, it's not just the large number of respondents that matters.
Right.
And the exact number is really something that can be debated, particularly based on what you're counting. So of course it would be ideal to have large sample surveys like the National Sample Survey does, or now private agencies like the National Council for Applied Economic Research, or CMI, Center for Monitoring of the Indian Economy. These are all 1 lakh plus households, and you'd say that's a good sample size for India. But quick opinion polling is never going to be at this scale, though it's possible that it could change in the future, partly because of the wide availability of phones, that might change the future of opinion polling in India. If that gets better.
Okay.
So I mean, the basic hygiene checks are what is important. It's important to look at the methodology. Look at what was used as is it meant to be a representative sample? If so, on what grounds? Is the raw data available to be looked at? So I'd say Pew, while a small sample, and not always a small sample, when they focus on India, they do large samples like 30,000 in the case of the religion survey. But sometimes, when it's a large inter-country survey, it's 1,000 people. And sure, I wouldn't discount findings from a Pew and a World Value survey entirely, but sure, you could want surveys that cover a larger number of people, and you would want people with the specialization. It's not just the numbers, also the specialization to be able to ask these questions in a way that are more likely to elicit responses, because these are very sensitive issues.
Correct.
So sure, some healthy skepticism is a good idea, but with purpose, right? Let's find out what's wrong or what's missing rather than blanket suspicion.
Right. There is one curious dichotomy that emerges when Indians are asked about their approach to other religions. I'll read two statements from your book. The first one: nearly two-thirds of Hindus said it is important to be Hindu to be truly Indian. Whereas in the same global survey, Indians were found to be big supporters of the right to practice one's religion freely. I'll read from your book again. Across all major religious groups, most people said it was very important to respect all religions to be truly Indian. Now, does this dichotomy speak to how questions are worded, how granular or broad the statement or the question asked is? Which survey is truly, I mean, which part of this is truly representative?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and in a sense, it cut to the heart of the point that chapter seeks to make, which is that I feel that very facile inferences from surveys, sometimes driven by the press release put out by the surveyor themselves, end up driving the narrative and get repeated ad nauseum. So
Okay.
here's the important or interesting part of the two sentences that you marked out. They're both findings from the same survey. They're both findings from the Pew survey. And as you pointed out, people say that a majority of Hindus say that being Hindu is important part of being Indian, while simultaneously they say that people should have the right to practice their own religions. So what ended up happening after this survey, which was a very good survey, but the headline across the board was that it was in a way driven by the summary of the report that was put out. And these sound like minor issues, but I'm getting to a broader point, which is that sometimes we allow a narrative to dominate without looking at the details of it. And the headline that came out of this was that Indians believe in religious freedom across the board, but in their own lives might practice exclusionary practices. And I actually disagree with the first part of that, which is that I don't think that a simple one line answer of sure everybody should get to practice their own religion should be taken as shorthand for broad Indian tolerance. I think the vast majority of the answers of the survey came out on the side of being intolerant and exclusionary, and it was quite dismaying to that this is how that survey was reported. I do not see it as a survey that showed broad tolerance at home. I see it as a survey that showed broad intolerance. So part of the reason that data journalism matters, or simply sort of familiarity with data for anybody, whether a journalist or a person reading the papers, is because it allows you to cut through the press release. And that what that means is, in a sense, when it comes to the government, it means it allows you to cut through propaganda. When it comes to corporates, it can allow you to cut through flattering headlines to drive up market value. When it comes to an international agency that may not necessarily have a vested interest in it, it does help cut through what they might have determined the headline is, which may not have any may or may not be sort of accurately represented in the data. So
Okay.
those two very lines that you pointed out really cut to the heart of the issue for me, which is allowing preset narratives to just go on running, despite me telling you this, and despite me writing this book, I do think that next year and the year after that, the sort of one line takeaway on religion in India for a global audience will continue to be this, the one that was said by the Pew Survey and repeated by all of the media, which is broad tolerance but intolerance at home. And I just don't see that as being accurate at all.
Right. Also, interreligious marriages seem to exercise people across the board. I want to focus on what, to my utter distress, I learned were the predominant views of the young people in our country. Can I also sort of marry this with views on gender norms? Again, data here belies the fairly widely held belief that younger folks are relatively more liberal.
Yes, absolutely. And again, I feel like this is something when when you start marshalling the data, you realize that this is something that's been coming out of surveys repeatedly, but we've not sort of sat down with it. Which is that systematically on beliefs that on questions that measure things like support or opposition to intercaste and interreligious marriage, freedom of expression, the right to eat what you want, younger people do not demonstrate more quote unquote liberal beliefs. And it's not just of what in terms of what they tell surveyors, it also is in terms of actual actions, which
Okay.
is that the share of people who have an intercaste marriage has not grown at all over the last 60 years. The share of intercaste marriage among people in their 20s is the same as it was among people who are currently in their 80s. So it's not just what young people are telling surveyors, it's also how they are sort of proceeding with their lives. And I think this again gets to sort of one of the broader points of this chapter, which is that if you look at political theory or behavioral theory generally across the world, the sort of broad belief is that processes like a country getting richer, more urbanized, more educated, uh, will sort of largely automatically lead to more liberal values. And I think we are seeing this time and again that's not happening, and it's important to take stock of that, because if there is, and I don't by no means do I see this around me in India, but if some people believe that there is value in a national project that seeks to make a more tolerant country, if there is a national project to think of for that, we have to sort of give up on the dream that this is going to happen automatically. It's absolutely not going to happen automatically, and if this is an aim, then we have to start thinking about what is needed to change those norms. And I place a lot of faith in politics, and because I do see that norms for things like acceptance of Dalits in positions of power is something that politics drove, and then that created broader changes in society. There is some evidence on that, and in addition, for women as well.
Right.
So, this will take work, whether it means through politics, whether it means through something else. It's important to acknowledge that younger people do not either profess or practice more liberal values, because if you want that to change, then you're going to have to think about how to do it.
Okay. Rukmini, if we could now focus on what caste means to Indians. Justice Chandrachud recently said castelessness is a privilege only the upper caste can afford. He was, of course, making the point that caste privilege has already translated into social, political, and economic capital. On the other hand, individuals who belong to the lower caste have to retain their caste identity in order to claim benefits of measures such as reservations, which are in themselves a recognition of a historic harm. Now, your book tells me that even the widely repeated assertion by many upper caste people that they, as individuals, live casteless lives isn't necessarily true.
Yes, and in fact, I dispute sort of both parts of it, which is, of course, upper castes are not living casteless lives. They are, as the data in this book shows, very actively practicing untouchability at its most crude form, not just its sort of refined forms in terms of, anti-meat eating and those other sorts of codes for what is essentially untouchability. They're practicing untouchability. They're systematically opposed to intercaste marriage, most particularly, the highest rejection rate again in a decoy survey was for Dalit prospective grooms. So, again, it's absolutely not, these are not casteless lives by any means. I'd also push back against the second part of it, which is that this thought that people from marginalized castes are holding on to caste identities for benefits is horribly problematic as well. I mean, if on a daily basis you are being systematically discriminated against in physical, violent, as well as sort of through words, systematically every day, you know I find it quite obnoxious to think of it in terms of holding on to an identity that is being for benefits, while what's happening is actually the sort of weaponization and brutalization against you of that identity that you were born into. So I do want to push back against that second part of it as well. And there is the data that I've referred to about things like the practice of untouchability, as well as which upper castes are most likely to practice, as well as against intercaste marriage. But also, I think there's really all these reality checks that we should be having more conversations about when it comes to things like income and jobs, for example. So the acknowledgement that upper caste and Brahmins in particular are by far the richest and have continued to be, despite the marginal effects of affirmative action over time, is something that needs to be reiterated. Forward castes have a household income nearly 1.5 times the Indian average, and for Muslims in particular, mobility over time has absolutely flattened, if not fallen. That's something that you cannot push. You cannot go on peddling this victimhood myth when this is what the data shows. And it's similarly in the case for jobs as well, which is that part of the reason for this push for government jobs, in addition to the stability that it offers, is also that the inequities in salaries that are particularly sharp in the private sector are somewhat softened in the government sector, but there too they exist. And as I say in the book, regardless of the sector, forward castes have higher salaries than OBCs, Dalits, Adivasis, and Muslims. And I mean this for the same job.
Okay.
The differences in government salaries by social group are less in the public sector at the lower and higher skill levels. But these are the very sort of concrete lived experiences, even in the economy of caste. So yeah, both ends of it are ludicrous to me, looking at the data and literally talking to anyone who lived experiences. These are the concept of castelessness among the upper castes is ludicrous, as is the sort of belief that people from marginal castes are holding on to caste identities for benefits. It's offensive.
Right. Rukmini, data tells us what is what, it doesn't tell us why. On the question of how committed Indians are to democratic principles, the findings confound me. Why would a people who've lived relatively freely since 1947 in a democracy that is flawed, yet that has delivered on many counts of individual freedoms, why would such a people seem to sort of show so much alacrity to curb those freedoms, at least of others? Is that something you reflect on, or is that sort of exposition only for sociologists to make?
No, I think about it, but I don't have the answers. I think about it particularly because, even in writing the book, I have spent some time thinking about the post independence moment, because among all the other idealisms that flowered then was also idealism around data, and data as being central to the democratic project, to the development project. And when you read all of the words of those times, then yeah, you truly feel like you truly feel the weight of these failures. If 85 years ago Ambedkar said that intercaste marriage is the only true solvent for caste, and we still have a majority of people who admit in surveys to being opposed to intercaste marriage, then it's shameful for the democratic project as a whole. And the fact that it isn't considered shameful or something that should be worked on hard enough is the problem. So that's really what I've ended up feeling is that cannot systematically think of many people in the last 10 or 20 years who have made this sort of pushback against illiberal, intolerant, casteist, Islamophobic, misogynist values as a central Indian project, and that has meant a sort of failure of norm setting. And I guess it's important to think beyond politics as well, because I do think about norm setting in politics and where that has faltered, and I think it is faltering significantly at the moment in particular. But I suppose it's also to think about broader norm setting, whether in educational institutions, what are the other democratic institutions that should have been professing these values. And one of the reasons that I do try to make this point about widely held beliefs substantially, although data would typically, even the data I typically look at tends to look about concrete things like health or incomes.
Okay.
But I felt it was important to look at this data about thoughts and beliefs, because I don't think this exercises us enough, and thinking hard about how these are not fringe beliefs really becomes important. If you think of it in very sort of literal terms, when it came to the pandemic, and then you realize the extent of misinformation that was out there, or sort of beliefs in non-scientific medical treatments, and all of us know members of our families who are absolutely either true believers in homeopathy, which is a junk science, or in other untested sort of natural practices, or some even in godmen like people. And I suppose that maybe we let that fly for some time, and then when it came to actually a relative who would not agree to get vaccinated, or sort of believed COVID was a hoax or something like that, that's when you really felt that, wow, we should have been having these conversations in peacetime, so that we would have got somewhere by now. And that feels like an analogy to me to all of this as well, which is that it's not harmless. These views are not harmless. These views are not fringe views, and we need to sit with that feeling to decide the course of future action.
Yes. Well, Rukmini, thanks so much for all of this. I'm currently on the last chapter of your book, How India Falls Sick and Gets Better. It's an absolute eye opener. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. I really enjoyed thinking about it in all of these ways. And every time I speak to someone who's read it and is engaging with it, it's interesting to me to think of the new things that they, take from it, and think more deeply about those things. So yeah, thanks a lot for this.
Right. Thanks also to our listeners. I'll be back next Friday for the last episode of the year 2021.